The courtroom fell silent as the man at the defense table stood up, his smirk cutting through the tension like a knife. He was tall and rough-looking, with an air of arrogance that seemed to make the walls of the courtroom shrink. All eyes were on him, but his were locked on the judge seated at the bench, a petite, sharp-eyed woman who had commanded the courtroom with quiet authority since the trial began. "Your Honor," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Or should I say, Your Majesty? Do you practice that holier-than-thou look in the mirror every morning, or is it just natural?" The gallery gasped audibly. The bailiff stepped forward instinctively, but the judge raised a hand to stop him, her expression as calm as still water. The defendant chuckled, clearly pleased with himself, and continued. "Bet you love telling people what to do, huh? I mean, what else would someone like you have going for them? It's not like you got the job because of talent or anything. We all know how it works." A few murmurs rippled through the crowd. A reporter scribbled furiously in her notepad. The judge maintained her poise, her hands clasped firmly on the bench in front of her. She opened her mouth to speak, but before she could, the defendant crossed his arms and sneered. "Don't bother with your speech. We both know you can't handle someone like me. You can't scare me, ma'am. You're just another suit pretending to have power." The silence that followed was deafening. Everyone waited for her response, but what came next stunned the courtroom into a different kind of silence altogether. The defendant leaned forward, pointing directly at the judge, and said, "I dare you to prove me wrong." Her eyes narrowed slightly, but there was no anger in her voice when she finally spoke. "Mr. Harris," she began slowly, her tone measured and firm, "you've crossed a line, and what happens next will not be because I'm trying to prove you wrong. It will be because justice demands it." And then, with a single, calm motion, she reached for her gavel and brought it down with a loud, resounding crack. "Bailiff," she said, "take Mr. Harris into custody for contempt of court." The crowd erupted, half in outrage and half in applause. Harris's smirk faltered for the first time as two officers approached him. He glanced around, realizing his confidence might have gone too far, but it was too late. His mouth opened as if to protest, but the judge raised her hand once again. "Enough," she said, her voice slicing through the chaos. "You've had your say. Now it's time for the law to speak." Earlier that morning, the courtroom had been buzzing with anticipation. The trial of Luke Harris, a notorious con artist accused of defrauding dozens of people out of their life savings, had drawn massive attention. He was slick and charming, the kind of man who could smile while stealing the shirt off your back. His victims ranged from struggling single mothers to elderly retirees, all of whom had trusted him with everything they had. Presiding over the case was Judge Emily Carter, a woman known for her fairness and dedication to the law. She had worked her way up from a small-town lawyer to one of the youngest judges in the state, earning respect from colleagues and fear from those who thought they could manipulate the system. But today, her usual calm demeanor was being put to the test. From the moment Harris entered the courtroom, he had been a thorn in her side. He smirked at the jury, made snide comments under his breath, and even winked at one of the reporters. His behavior was designed to distract and unsettle, and for the most part, it was working. Emily, however, refused to be rattled. She knew men like Harris, men who thought charm and bravado could get them out of anything. But she also knew something he didn't. The truth always caught up with you in the end. The trial had been progressing as expected, with witnesses testifying to Harris's lies and manipulations. One by one, they recounted how he had promised them riches and security, only to leave them broke and desperate. Tears filled the eyes of a retired teacher as she explained how she'd lost her home because of Harris's schemes. A young father clenched his fists as he described how his family had gone hungry while Harris lived in luxury. But through it all, Harris showed no remorse. He leaned back in his chair, occasionally whispering to his attorney or chuckling at the witness's pain. It was clear he thought he was untouchable, until the moment he made the mistake of mocking the judge. As Harris was led away in handcuffs, the courtroom buzzed with whispers. Some were shocked, others were relieved, but everyone knew one thing. This trial was far from over. Judge Carter watched him go, her face betraying no emotion, but inside, her thoughts were racing. She knew Harris was dangerous, not just because of what he had done, but because of who he was. His confidence came from years of getting away with everything, and she suspected he had more secrets than anyone realized. The question was, how far would he go to keep them hidden? As the doors closed behind him, Emily took a deep breath and turned her attention back to the courtroom. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, addressing the jury, "let's continue." But in her heart, she knew this wasn't just another case. This was a battle for justice, for truth, and for the countless lives Luke Harris had destroyed. And she wasn't going to let him win. The day wasn't over yet, and neither was the fight. And what happened next would shock them all. The courtroom doors slammed shut behind Luke Harris, but his arrogant smirk was nowhere to be seen. The cold steel of the handcuffs bit into his wrists as the bailiff led him to a holding cell. For the first time in years, Luke felt a small crack in his armor of confidence. Yet, even as fear began to creep in, he couldn't let it show. Not to them. He leaned toward the bailiff with a sly grin, attempting to regain his bravado. "You know this is all a misunderstanding, right? She's just trying to make a name for herself. Judges love the spotlight." The bailiff didn't reply. He merely gave Luke a hard shove into the small, dimly lit cell and locked the door. Luke sighed and slumped onto the bench, staring at the peeling paint on the walls. He wasn't used to being on this side of the bars. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. Meanwhile, back in the courtroom, Judge Carter regained her composure, addressing the jury with unwavering authority. "Let's not allow distractions to deter us from the task at hand," she said. "We are here to seek the truth, and the truth must prevail." The jury nodded in unison, their focus now fully on the case. Emily Carter was determined to keep things moving, even if Harris's antics had rattled everyone else. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that this case was bigger than it seemed. Harris wasn't just some petty con artist. He was a mastermind, a man who thrived on manipulation, and she had a nagging suspicion he still had tricks up his sleeve. The trial resumed with another witness taking the stand. A middle-aged woman named Linda Green, her voice trembling, recounted how she had invested her entire life savings in Harris's fraudulent business. "He looked me in the eyes," she said, tears streaming down her face, "and promised me that my money would grow. I trusted him. I believed him." Her words hung heavy in the air. The jury watched her closely, their faces etched with sympathy. Luke Harris's attorney, a smug-looking man named Richard Caldwell, rose to cross-examine. "Mrs. Green," Caldwell began smoothly, "did my client force you to give him your money?" "No," Linda admitted, her voice barely audible. "So you willingly invested, knowing there was a risk?" Caldwell pressed, his tone dripping with condescension. "Ah, yes, but—" "No further questions, Your Honor," Caldwell said, cutting her off with a satisfied smile. He turned to Luke, who was watching from the holding cell via a live video feed. Luke gave him a subtle nod of approval. Hours passed, and the courtroom proceedings dragged on. Witness after witness came forward, each one adding another layer to the damning picture of Luke Harris's crimes. But with every testimony, Caldwell found a way to sow seeds of doubt, painting Luke as a victim of circumstance rather than the predator he truly was. As the day drew to a close, Judge Carter dismissed the jury for the evening. "We'll reconvene tomorrow at 9 a.m. sharp," she announced, her voice firm but fatigued. The courtroom slowly emptied, leaving Emily alone with her thoughts. She sat at the bench, staring at the case files in front of her. Something about this case didn't sit right with her. Harris's overconfidence wasn't just bravado, it was strategy. But why? Just as she was about to pack up and leave, her clerk, Sarah, approached her with a concerned expression. "Judge Carter," she said hesitantly, "there's something you should see." Emily frowned and followed Sarah to her office. Sarah handed her a file marked confidential and said, "This came in from a whistleblower earlier today. I wasn't sure if it was credible, but after what happened in court today, I think you need to look at it." Emily opened the file, her eyes scanning the pages quickly. What she saw made her blood run cold. There were documents linking Luke Harris to a much larger network of fraud, a network involving high-ranking officials, offshore accounts, and potentially even law enforcement. This wasn't just about conning a few dozen people out of their money. This was organized crime on a scale Emily had never encountered before. As she read further, she came across something even more alarming, a list of names. Among them was Richard Caldwell, Harris's attorney. Emily's mind raced. If Caldwell was involved, it explained why he was so intent on defending Harris. But it also meant that the courtroom wasn't safe. If Harris and Caldwell were part of this network, there was no telling how far their influence reached, or what they were willing to do to protect their operation. Before Emily could process everything, her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and saw an anonymous message. "Stay out of this, Judge Carter. You don't know who you're dealing with." Her heart pounded as she stared at the words. She looked around the empty office, suddenly feeling exposed. Whoever had sent the message knew she had the file. They were watching her. Meanwhile, in his holding cell, Luke Harris leaned back against the cold wall, a small, satisfied smile creeping onto his face. He wasn't worried. Judge Carter might think she had the upper hand, but she had no idea what she was up against. He had powerful friends, and they wouldn't let him go down without a fight. As the night deepened, the courthouse grew quiet. But beneath the surface, tension simmered like a volcano ready to erupt. Emily Carter knew she was in over her head, but she couldn't back down. Not now. Not when the truth was finally within reach. What she didn't know was that the next day would bring a twist she could never have anticipated. A twist that would change everything. And just as the clock struck midnight, a loud explosion rocked the courthouse, shattering windows and sending shockwaves through the empty halls. Emily bolted upright from her chair, her heart racing as alarms blared around her. This wasn't just a case anymore. It was war. The courthouse was in chaos. Alarms echoed through the halls, and the faint smell of smoke began to creep into Judge Carter's office. She bolted out of her chair, heart pounding, and rushed to the window. Down below, she could see people scattering in every direction. Emergency vehicles were already pulling up with sirens blaring. She grabbed the confidential file off her desk and shoved it into her briefcase, her instincts screaming that this was no accident. Someone had orchestrated this, and she was certain it had everything to do with the case. As she moved to leave her office, her phone buzzed again. Another message lit up the screen. "You've been warned. Drop the case, or the next one won't be a warning." Emily's blood ran cold, but her resolve only hardened. Whoever was behind this thought they could intimidate her into backing down. They didn't know her well enough. She was going to see this case through, no matter the cost. Taking a deep breath, she stepped out into the hallway, determined to get to the bottom of what had just happened. Outside, the scene was pandemonium. Police officers were setting up barricades, reporters jostled for a closer look, and firefighters worked quickly to assess the damage. The explosion had come from the parking garage, where several cars were now engulfed in flames. Emily scanned the crowd, her eyes landing on Sarah, who was frantically waving her over. "Judge Carter," Sarah shouted, her voice almost drowned out by the chaos. "Over here." Emily hurried to her. "Are you okay?" she asked, gripping Sarah's arm. "I'm fine," Sarah said, though her face was pale. "But they think it was deliberate. A bomb." Emily nodded grimly. She had already figured as much. "Did anyone get hurt?" "Not yet," Sarah said, "but the firefighters haven't finished searching. They're saying it could have been a distraction, someone trying to send a message." Emily's stomach twisted. She had no doubt the message was meant for her. Just then, Detective Charles Reed, the lead investigator on the Harris case, approached them. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a no-nonsense demeanor that usually brought a sense of calm. Tonight, though, his expression was dark. "Judge Carter," he said, his voice low, "we need to talk." Emily followed him to a quieter corner, away from the reporters and flashing cameras. "What do you know?" she asked. "It was definitely a bomb," Charles said, crossing his arms. "Preliminary evidence suggests it was timed to go off after the court session ended. Whoever planted it didn't want casualties. They wanted to send a warning." Emily nodded. "I got the message loud and clear. They want me to drop the Harris case." Charles frowned. "You think Harris is behind this?" "Not just Harris," Emily said, pulling the confidential file out of her briefcase. "There's more to this case than we realized. He's part of a larger network, organized crime, offshore accounts, the works. And his attorney, Richard Caldwell, is involved too. Charles's jaw tightened as he flipped through the file. If this is true, we're dealing with something way bigger than a fraud case. We are, Emily said. And now they're trying to scare me off. Charles looked at her, his expression serious. You don't scare easily, do you? No, Emily said firmly. But this isn't just about me. It's about everyone Harris and his network have hurt. I can't walk away from this. Charles nodded. Then we'll protect you. But you need to be careful. These people don't play fair. Emily knew he was right, but she also knew there was no turning back. She was in too deep now, and the only way out was through. The next morning, the courthouse was eerily quiet. The parking garage was sealed off with yellow tape, and the air was heavy with tension. The trial resumed as scheduled, but the atmosphere in the courtroom was different. The jury looked uneasy, the witnesses seemed nervous, and even the reporters appeared subdued. Luke Harris was back at the defense table, his hands no longer cuffed but his smirk firmly in place. If the explosion had shaken him, he didn't show it. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, watching the room like a predator sizing up its prey. Judge Carter entered the courtroom, her robe billowing behind her. She didn't let her unease show as she took her seat. Court is now in session, she said, her voice steady. Let's proceed. The prosecution called their next witness, a young woman named Rachel, who had worked as Luke Harris's assistant for 3 years. Rachel's testimony was damning, detailing how Harris had orchestrated his schemes and laundered money through offshore accounts. He had no remorse, Rachel said, her voice trembling. He used people, destroyed their lives, and then moved on to the next target. He always said he was untouchable. Why did you stay? The prosecutor asked gently. Rachel hesitated, her eyes darting to Harris. Because I was afraid. He said if I ever spoke out, I'd regret it. Harris chuckled softly, loud enough for Rachel to hear. She flinched, and the prosecutor shot him a glare. Judge Carter leaned forward. Mr. Harris, she said sharply, if you can't control yourself, I will have you removed from this courtroom. Harris raised his hands in mock surrender. Just enjoying the show, Your Honor. Emily's eyes narrowed, but she didn't respond. Instead, she turned her attention back to Rachel. You're safe here, she said, her tone gentle but firm. No one can hurt you now. Rachel nodded, tears welling in her eyes. I just want justice, she said, for everyone he hurt. As the testimony continued, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. Harris was too calm, too confident. He was up to something. She could feel it. The day dragged on, and just as the court was about to adjourn, an unexpected visitor entered the courtroom. A man in a crisp suit walked in, carrying a briefcase and flanked by 2 equally well-dressed associates. He approached the defense table and whispered something to Caldwell, who immediately stood up. Your Honor, Caldwell said, I'd like to request a brief recess to confer with my client. Emily frowned but nodded. 10 minutes, she said. As Harris and Caldwell huddled with the mysterious newcomer, Emily felt a knot of unease tighten in her stomach. Something wasn't right. And then, as the recess ended and everyone returned to their seats, the man in the suit stood up and addressed the court. Your Honor, he said, his voice smooth and confident, my name is Daniel Shaw. I represent an interested third party in this case, and I have evidence that may exonerate Mr. Harris. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Emily's heart sank. This was the twist she had been dreading. What evidence? She demanded. Daniel Shaw smiled. Documents, Your Honor. Documents that prove my client is being framed. Emily's mind raced. If this was another one of Harris's tricks, it was a good one. And she knew, without a doubt, that the battle was far from over. The tension in the courtroom was suffocating. Judge Carter leaned forward, her sharp gaze fixed on Daniel Shaw. The man exuded confidence, his perfectly tailored suit and smooth demeanor giving him an air of authority. He held up a sleek black briefcase, patting it lightly as if it held all the answers. Mr. Shaw, Emily said, her voice calm but firm, this is highly irregular. You can't just walk into an ongoing trial claiming to have evidence without proper procedure. I understand, Your Honor, Shaw replied smoothly. But this case is far from ordinary, and the evidence I have is far from trivial. It will prove that Mr. Harris is being targeted unfairly by individuals who wish to scapegoat him. Emily's stomach churned. This was classic misdirection. She had seen it before in cases where high-powered attorneys tried to outmaneuver the system. But this wasn't just a game. It was a battle for justice, and she wasn't about to let Shaw manipulate the court. "Approach the bench," she ordered. Shaw complied, his polished shoes clicking against the courtroom floor. As he handed the briefcase to the bailiff, he said, "I think you'll find the contents enlightening, Your Honor." Emily signaled for the bailiff to open it, and inside were neatly organized folders and a USB drive. She motioned for the court clerk to review the contents, who plugged the drive into a laptop. The courtroom waited in tense silence as the clerk's eyes scanned the screen. "It's financial documents, Your Honor," the clerk said hesitantly. "Bank transfers, emails. They suggest that someone else orchestrated the fraud." The gallery erupted in whispers. Emily's gavel slammed down, restoring order. "Quiet," she commanded before turning to Shaw. "How did you obtain this evidence?" Shaw smiled faintly. "My client's supporters have been conducting their own investigation, Your Honor. They believe Mr. Harris is being framed by corrupt individuals within the financial sector." "Convenient," Emily said, her tone ice-cold. "You expect me to admit this without verification?" "Of course not," Shaw replied. "I'm simply requesting a delay in the proceedings to allow for an independent review of these documents." Emily's mind raced. This delay could give Harris and his associates time to regroup, or worse, escape. But rejecting the evidence outright would risk giving them grounds for appeal later. She was trapped between two bad options. "We'll recess until tomorrow morning," Emily said finally. "The prosecution and defense will each have time to review the new evidence. But let me be clear. This court will not be manipulated. If this is a ploy to derail justice, I will not tolerate it." Her words hung in the air as she adjourned the court. Harris leaned back in his chair, his smug grin firmly in place, while Caldwell and Shaw exchanged satisfied glances. Emily stepped down from the bench, her expression unreadable, but inside, her frustration was boiling over. Later that evening, Emily sat in her chambers, poring over the documents Shaw had introduced. On the surface, they appeared legitimate: detailed bank statements, email chains, even signed contracts implicating a different group of individuals in the fraud. But something about them didn't feel right. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. "Come in," she said, expecting Sarah or Detective Reed. Instead, Charles Reed entered, a grim look on his face. "I've been digging," he said without preamble. "Shaw's firm is connected to one of the offshore accounts mentioned in your whistleblower file." Emily's heart sank. "So he's part of the network?" Charles nodded. "It looks that way. They're trying to muddy the waters, make it harder for us to pin anything on Harris." Emily rubbed her temples, exhaustion creeping in. "They're good at this. Too good." "They've had years of practice," Charles said. "But they made a mistake. That whistleblower file you got, it matches some of the details in their so-called evidence. They're trying to frame someone else to cover their tracks, but the timeline doesn't add up." Emily's eyes lit up. "So we can prove it's a fabrication?" "Not yet," Charles admitted. "But we're close. If we can get to the source of those documents, we might find the smoking gun." "Do it," Emily said. "Whatever it takes." Charles hesitated. "You need to be careful, Judge. These people play dirty. Tonight's bomb was just the beginning." Emily met his gaze, her resolve unshaken. "I'm not backing down, Charles. If we don't stop them now, they'll keep ruining lives." The next morning, the courtroom was packed. Word of the explosion and the new evidence had spread, drawing even more media attention. Harris sat at the defense table, his confidence unwavering, while Shaw and Caldwell whispered to each other. Emily entered the courtroom, her presence commanding silence. She took her seat and addressed the court. "Before we proceed, I want to remind everyone that this is a court of law, not a stage for theatrics. Justice will be served, and the truth will come to light." The prosecution began by challenging the new evidence, pointing out inconsistencies in the timeline. Shaw countered with practiced ease, deflecting each point with smooth rhetoric. The courtroom was a battlefield, and the tension was palpable. But just as the prosecution was about to call their next witness, The doors burst open. A man in a rumpled suit stumbled in, clutching a folder. He was out of breath, his face pale with urgency. "Your Honor," he shouted, "I have evidence that changes everything." The courtroom erupted in chaos. Emily banged her gavel, demanding order, as the man approached the bench. He handed her the folder, his hands shaking. Emily opened it cautiously. Inside were photographs, emails, and surveillance reports, all pointing to a chilling conclusion. Luke Harris wasn't just a con artist. He was a key figure in a massive criminal syndicate, and the explosion at the courthouse wasn't just a warning. It was part of a larger plan. Emily's eyes widened as she realized the implications. "Who are you?" she demanded. "My name is David Green," the man said. "I used to work for them." I couldn't stay silent anymore. The gallery gasped, and Emily's gavel slammed down again. "Mr. Green, you realize the risk you're taking by coming forward?" "I do," David said, his voice trembling. "But they're planning something big, bigger than this trial. If you don't stop them now, it'll be too late." Emily's heart pounded as she stared at the man. The courtroom was silent, every eye on her. And in that moment, she knew this case was no longer just about Luke Harris. It was about dismantling an entire empire of corruption. What she didn't know was that the real danger was already closing in. The courtroom buzzed with whispers as Judge Carter stared at the trembling man standing before her. David Green's disheveled appearance and the urgency in his voice struck a nerve. But Emily knew better than to let her emotions dictate her next move. "Mr. Green," she said, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her, "you've just made a serious allegation. If you're lying, you'll face severe consequences. Do you understand?" David nodded, sweat trickling down his forehead. "I'm not lying, Your Honor. I've been part of their operation for years. I couldn't take it anymore. They'll come after me for this, but I had to do the right thing." Emily motioned for the bailiff to escort him to a secure area. "You'll remain under protective custody until we verify your claims," she said firmly. Turning back to the court, she addressed the jury and gallery. "We're adjourning for a short recess. Everyone is to remain in the building." As the courtroom emptied, Emily hurried to her chambers with Detective Reed and David Green. The weight of the case bore down on her, but she knew this could be the breakthrough they needed. In her chambers, David sat across from Emily and Charles, nervously fidgeting with his hands. He looked over his shoulder every few seconds, as though expecting someone to burst in. "Start from the beginning," Emily said, leaning forward. "What exactly are we dealing with?" David swallowed hard. "Luke Harris isn't just a con artist. He's a frontman for a criminal syndicate called the Network. They specialize in financial fraud, money laundering, and blackmail. Harris's schemes are small compared to what they're really doing. Offshore accounts, shell companies, even politicians on their payroll. It's all connected." Emily exchanged a glance with Charles. This wasn't just a case of greed. It was systemic corruption. "What about the explosion?" Charles asked. "That was a distraction," David said. "They knew the court was closing in on Harris, so they sent a message. But it's more than that. They're trying to erase evidence before anyone connects the dots. I have proof, documents, emails, transaction logs. But they'll kill me if they find out I gave them to you." Emily's hands tightened into fists. "Where is this proof?" "I uploaded it to a secure drive," David said, scribbling a URL and password onto a piece of paper. "But you have to act fast. They'll try to hack it or destroy the servers." Charles took the paper and stood. "I'll get my team on this immediately. We'll pull the data and cross-reference it with what we already have." "Be careful," David warned. "These people have eyes everywhere." Charles nodded grimly and left the room. Emily turned her attention back to David. "Why now? Why come forward after all this time?" David's shoulders slumped. "I thought I could live with it. The money, the power. It blinded me. But then I saw what they did to people. Families destroyed, lives ruined. And when they planted that bomb, I realized they wouldn't stop. I don't want to be part of that anymore." Emily studied him for a moment. His remorse seemed genuine, but she couldn't afford to trust him completely. "Not yet. You've done the right thing," she said finally. "But this is far from over." The recess ended, and the courtroom was packed once again. Tension hung in the air as Emily took her seat, her mind racing with the information David had shared. She glanced at Luke Harris, who sat confidently at the defense table, his smug expression as infuriating as ever. "Court is back in session," she announced, her gavel striking with authority. "Before we proceed, I have an important announcement. The court has received new testimony and evidence that requires immediate review. As such, this trial is temporarily suspended until further notice." The gallery erupted into chaos. Reporters shouted questions, spectators whispered furiously, and Harris shot a glare toward Emily that could have burned through steel. His attorney, Richard Caldwell, stood and protested. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. My client has the right to a fair and timely trial." Emily met his gaze with steely determination. "And the victims of your client's schemes have the right to justice. This court will reconvene once all evidence has been thoroughly examined." Before Caldwell could respond, Emily stood and left the bench, leaving the courtroom in a state of shock. Back in her chambers, Emily sat at her desk, her head in her hands. She was exhausted, but there was no time to rest. Charles had called to say his team was decrypting the files from David Green's secure drive, and what they'd found so far was damning. Bank transfers linked to government officials, offshore accounts tied to corporations, and a web of transactions implicating dozens of high-profile individuals. But as she processed the information, her phone buzzed. It was an anonymous message, last warning. "Drop the case, or everyone you love will pay the price." Emily's heart skipped a beat. She looked around the room, suddenly hyper-aware of how vulnerable she was. The weight of her decisions loomed large, but she knew backing down wasn't an option. She took a deep breath and replied to the message, "I'm not afraid of you." The response came almost instantly, "You should be." That night, as Emily prepared to leave the courthouse, she noticed a black car parked across the street. Its windows were tinted, and the engine idled quietly. She hesitated for a moment, then shook her head. She couldn't let paranoia get the better of her. But as she stepped into the dimly lit parking lot, the sound of footsteps behind her made her freeze. She turned slowly, her heart pounding, and saw two men in dark suits walking toward her. "Judge Carter," one of them said, his voice low and threatening. "We need to have a word." Emily's hand tightened around her briefcase. "I don't have anything to say to you." The men exchanged a glance, and one of them stepped closer. "You're making things difficult, Judge. Walk away from this case, and no one gets hurt." Emily squared her shoulders, refusing to let them intimidate her. "I don't take orders from criminals." The man smirked. "Then you've just made a very dangerous mistake." Before Emily could respond, a car screeched into the lot, its headlights blinding. The men cursed and backed away as Charles Reed jumped out, gun drawn. "Get in the car," Charles shouted. Emily didn't hesitate. She ran to the vehicle as the men disappeared into the shadows. As the car sped away, Emily's hands trembled. The fight wasn't over, but she had just survived another close call, and she knew the next one would be even closer. The car sped through the city streets, Charles gripping the wheel with one hand while his other hovered near his holstered gun. Judge Carter sat in the passenger seat, clutching her briefcase as her heart raced. She glanced over her shoulder, half expecting the shadowy men to follow, but the darkened streets behind them were empty. "Are you okay?" Charles asked, his voice steady but laced with concern. "I'm fine," Emily replied, though her trembling hands betrayed her. "Who were they?" "Probably hired goons," Charles said. "They're testing you, seeing how far they can push." Emily took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "Well, they're not going to push me out. I'm not giving up." Charles glanced at her, admiration flickering in his eyes. "You're brave, Judge, but these people don't play by the rules. They're desperate now, which makes them dangerous." Emily nodded, her resolve hardening. "Desperate means they're close to losing, and I won't let them win." Back at the safe house Charles had arranged, Emily paced the room while he coordinated with his team. The files retrieved from David Green's secure drive had been sent to federal investigators, and preliminary findings confirmed everything. The network was real, and Luke Harris was one of their key players. The evidence also revealed just how far their corruption spread. Politicians, law enforcement officials, even members of the judiciary. It was worse than Emily had imagined. Charles hung up the phone and turned to Emily. The feds are taking this seriously. They're launching an investigation, but it's going to take time. Until then, you're the key to keeping Harris and his associates in check. Emily stopped pacing. What about David? Is he safe? For now, Charles said. He's in protective custody, but he's terrified. He knows too much, and they know it. Emily sat down, exhaustion washing over her. What's their next move? Charles hesitated. They'll come after you again. And probably him. The weight of his words settled over the room like a heavy fog. Emily stared at the floor, her mind racing. She had faced difficult cases before, but nothing like this. This wasn't just about justice, it was about survival. The next day, the courtroom was buzzing with tension. Despite the threats, Emily had decided to return to the bench. She refused to let fear dictate her actions. The gallery was packed with reporters and spectators, all eager to see what would happen next. Luke Harris sat at the defense table, his smirk more pronounced than ever. His attorney, Richard Caldwell, looked uncharacteristically tense. Daniel Shaw was nowhere to be seen, which only heightened Emily's suspicions. Emily entered the courtroom, her presence silencing the chatter. She took her seat and called the court to order. Before we resume, I'd like to address recent events, she said, her voice firm. This court has been subjected to intimidation tactics, but let me make one thing clear. Justice will not be silenced. We will proceed, and we will uncover the truth. The gallery erupted in applause, but Emily quickly banged her gavel. Order, she commanded. This is still a courtroom. The prosecution resumed their case, presenting damning evidence from the whistleblower files. The documents linked Harris to multiple fraudulent schemes, offshore accounts, and connections to the network. The jury listened intently, their expressions growing darker with each revelation. But Harris didn't flinch. He whispered to Caldwell, who occasionally smiled and nodded. It was as if they knew something no one else did. As the trial continued, Emily noticed something odd. One of the jurors, a middle-aged man in a gray suit, kept glancing at his phone, his face pale and anxious. Emily's instincts told her something was wrong. During a recess, she called Charles into her chambers. Something's off with juror number 6, she said. I think he's being pressured. Charles frowned. I'll look into it. If they've gotten to the jury, this whole trial could be compromised. Emily's stomach tightened. The network's reach was wider than she'd anticipated. Be discreet, she warned. We can't let them know we're onto them. Charles nodded and left, leaving Emily alone with her thoughts. She knew this case was bigger than one man, but the deeper she dug, the more dangerous it became. That evening, as Emily prepared to leave the courthouse, she received another anonymous text. You were warned. Now it's time to make you listen. Her pulse quickened. She looked around, her senses on high alert, but the hallways were empty. She called Charles, her voice urgent. I just got another threat. They're planning something. I'll meet you outside, Charles said. Don't go anywhere alone. But as Emily approached the courthouse doors, a loud crash echoed through the building. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. Moments later, a fire alarm blared, and the smell of smoke filled the air. Panic erupted as people ran in all directions, shouting and scrambling to evacuate. Emily stayed calm, clutching her briefcase tightly as she moved toward the exit. But before she could reach the door, she was grabbed from behind. Don't scream, a voice hissed in her ear. You're coming with me. Emily's heart pounded as she struggled against her captor, but the man's grip was like steel. He dragged her toward a side exit, away from the chaos. Just as they reached the door, a shout rang out. Let her go. Emily turned her head and saw Charles running toward them, his gun drawn. The man cursed and shoved Emily aside. Reaching for a weapon, Charles fired a single shot, hitting the man in the shoulder. He dropped his gun and crumpled to the ground, groaning in pain. Emily stumbled back, her breath ragged. Charles rushed to her side, his eyes scanning her for injuries. Are you okay? I'm fine, she managed, though her knees felt weak. Who was he? Charles knelt beside the man, pulling out a badge. Hired muscle. Probably sent to scare you. Or worse. Emily's hands clenched into fists. They're getting bolder. We need to end this. Charles helped her to her feet, his expression grim. We will. But we have to play this smart. They're desperate now, and desperate people make mistakes. Emily nodded, her fear replaced by determination. She had come too far to back down now. The network had declared war, but she wasn't about to lose. Not when so much was at stake. As the police arrived to secure the scene, Emily stood tall, ready for the battle ahead. She knew the next move would be hers, and it would have to count. The next morning, the courthouse was swarming with law enforcement. Officers patrolled every hallway, and security checkpoints were tightened. The tension was palpable. Judge Carter stood in her chambers, staring out the window as she gathered her thoughts. The events of the previous night replayed in her mind. The struggle, the gunshot, the look of desperation in her attacker's eyes. Charles entered, carrying a fresh folder. His face was lined with exhaustion, but his determination hadn't wavered. "We've got a lead," he said without preamble. "The man who grabbed you, his name is Tony Vargas. He's a known enforcer for the network." "Did he talk?" Emily asked, turning to face him. Charles shook his head. "Not yet. He's tough, but we're working on it. What's more important is what we found on him." He opened the folder and spread its contents on her desk. "These are blueprints of the courthouse and your daily schedule." Emily's eyes widened. "They've been watching me this whole time." Charles nodded grimly. "It gets worse. We intercepted a communication from Vargas's phone. It's encrypted, but our tech team managed to piece some of it together. They're planning something big, and it's happening soon." Emily clenched her fists. "What are they trying to do? Intimidate me into backing down?" Charles hesitated before answering. "I don't think it's just about intimidation anymore. They've realized you're not going to quit. They're escalating. This isn't just about Luke Harris. It's about shutting down the entire investigation." Emily sat down, her mind racing. The network was playing a dangerous game, and she was at the center of it. But she refused to let fear control her. "What's our next move?" "We tighten security even more," Charles said, "and we prepare for anything. I've also requested backup from the federal task force. They're sending agents to assist." Emily nodded. "Good. We need all the help we can get." The trial resumed later that day, but the atmosphere in the courtroom was different. The jury looked wary, the spectators were subdued, and even Luke Harris seemed slightly on edge. Emily sat at the bench, her gaze unwavering as she called the court to order. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, addressing the jury, "despite recent events, it is imperative that we remain focused. Justice requires courage, and we must not allow fear to dictate our actions." The jury nodded, and the prosecution called their next witness, Detective Charles Reed. He took the stand and began detailing the evidence linking Harris to the network. As he spoke, Emily noticed Luke Harris's confident demeanor begin to crack. His smirk faded, replaced by a tight jaw and narrowed eyes. "Detective Reed," the prosecutor said, "can you confirm that the explosion at the courthouse parking garage was connected to Mr. Harris and his associates?" Charles nodded. "Yes. Evidence retrieved from a whistleblower file, as well as intercepted communications, indicate that the network orchestrated the attack to intimidate the court and halt the trial." The gallery murmured, and Harris shifted uncomfortably. His attorney, Caldwell, objected, but Emily overruled him. Charles continued, presenting damning evidence that painted Harris as a key figure in the network's operations. As the testimony unfolded, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. Harris's behavior was too calculated, his occasional glances toward Caldwell too deliberate. They were planning something. But what? The answer came during the afternoon recess. As the courtroom emptied for a break, Emily returned to her chambers. She sat at her desk, reviewing the evidence, when her phone buzzed. It was another anonymous message. "Last chance to walk away, Judge. If you don't, it won't just be you." Emily's breath caught. The threat was clear. They weren't just targeting her anymore. They were threatening her family, her friends, anyone connected to her. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a picture. It was her niece, Lily, walking home from school. Emily's blood ran cold. She immediately called Charles. "They're escalating," she said, her voice shaking. They sent me a picture of Lily. Stay calm, Charles said. We'll protect her. I'll send agents to her school and house right now. They won't get near her. Emily gripped her phone tightly. This has to end, Charles. They're going after innocent people. It will, Charles said. We just need to hold the line a little longer. The trial resumed after recess, and the prosecution continued presenting their case. The tension in the room was unbearable. Harris's smirk had returned, and Caldwell seemed more confident than ever. They were up to something. Emily could feel it. And then, it happened. As the prosecution called their final witness, the doors to the courtroom burst open. A group of men in suits stormed in, flashing badges. The lead agent stepped forward, addressing the court. Your Honor, I'm Agent Richard Dunn with the FBI. This trial is over. Emily stood, her voice sharp. On whose authority? On mine, Agent Dunn said, handing her a document. We're taking over this case. Effective immediately. The courtroom erupted in chaos. Reporters shouted questions, spectators gasped, and Harris leaned back in his chair, his smirk widening. Caldwell stood and began gathering his papers, looking smug. Emily read the document, her heart sinking. It was an official order, signed by a federal official. The FBI was claiming jurisdiction over the case, citing national security concerns. This isn't right, Emily said, her voice low. They're shutting us down. Agent Dunn didn't flinch. It's for your safety, Judge Carter. This case has become too dangerous for a state court. Emily clenched her fists. Dangerous for whom? The people or the truth? Agent Dunn didn't answer. He simply motioned for his team to escort Harris out of the courtroom. As the defendant was led away, he glanced back at Emily and winked. The gavel fell from her hand, hitting the desk with a dull thud. Emily sat frozen, watching as her courtroom, her fight for justice, was dismantled before her eyes. The network had made their move, and for the first time, it seemed they were winning. But Emily wasn't about to give up. Not yet. Not while there was still a chance to expose the truth. As the courtroom emptied, Emily whispered to herself, "This isn't over." The courtroom doors closed behind the FBI agents, leaving Judge Emily Carter sitting in stunned silence. Her hands rested on the bench, her mind racing. The trial, the evidence, the fight for justice, everything she had worked for, had just been snatched away. The crowd had dispersed, but the weight of the moment remained, pressing down on her. Charles entered the courtroom through a side door, his expression as grim as hers. "They pulled the rug out from under us," he said, his voice laced with frustration. "They didn't just pull the rug," Emily replied bitterly. "They set fire to it." Charles nodded, his jaw tightening. "I spoke with my contacts at the Bureau. Agent Dunn's move wasn't standard protocol. Someone high up is pulling strings." Emily leaned back in her chair, trying to process the implications. Harris's network is more powerful than we thought. They're not just infiltrating the system. They own parts of it. Charles placed a folder on her desk. "You're right, and this proves it. My team decrypted more of the files from David Green. The network has connections in federal law enforcement, the judiciary, even Congress. The people who shut down this trial, they're part of it." Emily flipped through the folder, her anger rising with every page. Names, bank transactions, and communications, all pointing to a web of corruption that extended far beyond her courtroom. "They're trying to bury this," she said, slamming the folder shut. "But we won't let them." Charles hesitated. "Emily, they're escalating. The threats, the attack last night, the message about Lily. They won't stop until you're silenced." Emily stood, her eyes blazing. "Let them come. If they think I'm going to back down, they don't know me." That evening, Emily returned to her secure location, but she couldn't rest. She pored over the files, searching for anything that could give her an edge. Every name, every transaction, every email was a piece of the puzzle. But the more she uncovered, the more daunting the task became. The network wasn't just a criminal organization. It was a shadow empire. A knock at the door broke her concentration. Charles entered, carrying his laptop. "We've got something," he said. "A lead." Emily motioned for him to sit. "What is it?" Charles placed the laptop on the table and pulled up a grainy surveillance video. This was taken 2 nights ago at a private airfield. That's Luke Harris boarding a jet. Emily frowned. 2 nights ago? That was before the FBI shut us down. Exactly, Charles said. The network was already preparing for this. They knew the trial would be taken over, and they're moving Harris to a safe location. But here's the kicker. He zoomed in on the timestamp. The flight was scheduled for last night, but it was delayed. The plane's still grounded. Emily's eyes widened. So he's still here? Charles nodded. Yes, but not for long. We've intercepted communications suggesting they're moving him tonight. If he gets on that plane, he's gone. Emily's heart raced. Where's the airfield? It's a private strip outside the city, Charles said. Heavily guarded. They're taking no chances. Emily's mind raced. This was her chance to stop Harris before he disappeared for good. But it was risky, dangerous, even. The network wouldn't let him go without a fight. I'm coming with you, she said firmly. Charles shook his head. Absolutely not. It's too dangerous. Emily glared at him. This is my case, Charles. My fight. I'm not going to sit back while they slip away. Charles sighed, recognizing the determination in her eyes. Fine, he said, but you follow my lead. No risks. Emily nodded. Agreed. Let's move. The airfield was shrouded in darkness, the only light coming from the faint glow of the runway. Emily and Charles crouched behind a row of crates, surveying the scene. Harris's jet sat at the far end, its engines idling. Guards in dark suits patrolled the area, their movements sharp and coordinated. Charles adjusted his earpiece, speaking softly into the mic. Team is in position. Wait for my signal. Emily's heart pounded as she watched the scene unfold. She spotted Harris near the jet, flanked by 2 guards. He looked calm, even smug, as though he had already won. The sight filled her with a renewed sense of purpose. They're loading him now, Charles said, his voice low. We need to move fast. Emily nodded, gripping the edge of the crate for support. Charles gave the signal, and his team moved in. Silently, they advanced, taking out guards with precision and efficiency. Emily stayed close to Charles, her adrenaline surging with every step. As they approached the jet, one of the guards spotted them and shouted. Chaos erupted. The guards opened fire, and Charles's team returned fire. Emily ducked behind a crate, her heart racing as bullets whizzed past her. Harris is making a run for it, Charles shouted. Emily peered out from behind the crate and saw Harris sprinting toward a waiting SUV. Without thinking, she bolted after him, determination overriding her fear. Emily, no, Charles shouted, but she didn't stop. She reached the SUV just as Harris climbed inside. She grabbed the door handle and yanked it open, pulling him out with all her strength. Harris stumbled, his eyes widening in shock. You? He spat, regaining his balance. You're out of your depth, Judge. Emily glared at him. Not this time, Harris. He lunged at her, but she dodged, grabbing a nearby metal rod from the ground. She swung it, catching him in the leg. Harris cried out and fell to the ground. Before he could recover, Charles and his team arrived, guns trained on him. Harris raised his hands, his smirk finally gone. It's over, Charles said, cuffing him. You're not going anywhere. Emily stood over Harris, her chest heaving. The fight wasn't over. Not yet, but for the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope. They had stopped him, and now they could finally uncover the full truth. But as the team secured the area, Charles's earpiece crackled. A voice came through, tense and urgent. Detective Reed, we've got a problem. There's chatter about a second operation. They're not done. Charles exchanged a glance with Emily. What kind of operation? The voice hesitated. It's a hit. Target unknown, but it's big. Emily's blood ran cold. The network wasn't giving up, and their next move could cost more than just the truth. The cold night air was heavy with tension as Charles's team secured Luke Harris. The subdued conman sat handcuffed on the tarmac, his smug facade cracked but not entirely broken. Emily Carter stood nearby, her chest heaving as the weight of the moment pressed on her. They had caught him, but Charles's earpiece crackled again, and the voice from his team made the victory feel hollow. The chatter's consistent, the voice said. This isn't just about extraction anymore. The network's planning a hit, and it's high priority. Details are still coming in, but you need to move. Charles turned to Emily, his expression grave. We have to get you out of here. Now. Emily's mind raced. Wait, she said. If it's a hit, it's not just about me. They're trying to protect something, or someone. Charles frowned. What are you thinking? I'm thinking we need to know who their target is, Emily replied. If this is about silencing someone, it could be our key to dismantling them. Charles sighed. We don't have time to play detective. If they're targeting you. It's not me, Emily interrupted. If it were, they'd have taken the shot already. This is bigger than me. Before Charles could argue, another voice crackled through his earpiece. Sir, we've intercepted another message. It's encrypted, but there's a name. David Green? Emily froze. David. He's the whistleblower. He has the proof they're trying to hide. Charles cursed under his breath. If they take him out, we lose everything. Emily's resolve hardened. Then we don't let that happen. The SUV tore through the city streets, sirens blaring as Charles drove with laser focus. Emily sat in the passenger seat, clutching her phone as she tried to reach David Green. The line rang endlessly, but there was no answer. He's not picking up, she said, her voice tight with worry. Charles glanced at her. He's in protective custody at a safe house. They won't get to him easily. You underestimate these people, Emily replied. If they've planned this, they've already found a way in. Charles's jaw tightened. He knew she was right. They arrived at the safe house minutes later, but something was wrong. The front gate was ajar, swinging gently in the wind. Charles killed the engine and signaled for his team to move in. Emily stayed behind, her heart pounding as Charles and the others entered the property. The silence was deafening, broken only by the crunch of gravel underfoot. She could see Charles's silhouette through the open doorway, his gun drawn as he disappeared inside. A moment later, she heard a shout. Clear the room. Charles barked. We've got a breach. Emily couldn't sit still any longer. Against her better judgment, she exited the vehicle and approached the house. The living room was in disarray. Furniture overturned, papers scattered. Charles turned to her as she entered, his face dark. They've been here, he said. David's gone. Emily's stomach sank. Gone? Or? Gone, Charles confirmed. There's no sign of a struggle. He either ran or was taken. Emily scanned the room, her eyes landing on a laptop that lay open on the coffee table. She crossed the room and opened the lid. The screen blinked to life, displaying an email draft. It's from David, she said, reading aloud. If anything happens to me, the files are on a backup drive. Coordinates attached. Charles leaned over her shoulder, reading the rest. It's a storage unit, he said, about 10 miles from here. Emily stood, her resolve hardening. Then we go. The storage facility was a nondescript building on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by a chain-link fence and dimly lit by flickering streetlights. Charles's team moved in first, securing the perimeter while Emily and Charles approached the main entrance. Which unit? Emily asked. Unit 47, Charles replied, consulting the email. They moved quickly, their footsteps echoing in the still night. When they reached the unit, Charles motioned for Emily to stay back. He used a lock-picking tool to open the door, revealing a small, cluttered space filled with boxes and a single filing cabinet. This is it, Charles said, pulling open the drawers. Inside, they found a hard drive, carefully labeled and tucked into a padded envelope. Charles handed it to Emily. This is the backup. We've got what we need. But just as relief began to wash over them, the sound of tires screeching pierced the night. Charles's team called over the radio. Multiple vehicles inbound. They're armed. Move, Charles shouted, pulling Emily behind a stack of boxes as gunfire erupted. The network's men had found them. The gunfight was brutal. Charles's team held their ground, returning fire as the attackers advanced. Emily clutched the hard drive, her pulse racing as she stayed low. She could hear Charles shouting commands, his voice steady despite the chaos. Fall back to the exit, he yelled. Cover the judge. Emily moved as quickly as she could, staying behind Charles as they navigated the labyrinth of storage units. Bullets ricocheted off the metal walls, and the air was thick with smoke and adrenaline. As they neared the exit, one of the attackers stepped into their path, a gun aimed directly at Emily. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. "Drop it," the man growled, motioning to the hard drive. Emily hesitated, her mind racing. If she handed it over, they'd lose everything. But if she didn't, before she could decide, a shot rang out. The man crumpled to the ground, and Charles appeared behind him, his gun smoking. "You okay?" he asked, pulling her to her feet. Emily nodded, clutching the hard drive tightly. "Let's get out of here." They made it back to the SUVs, the attackers retreating as Charles's team regrouped. The hard drive was safe, but the cost had been high. 2 of Charles's agents were injured, and the realization that the network's reach extended this far left everyone shaken. Emily sat in the vehicle, her hands trembling as she held the hard drive. "It's not over," she said softly. "They'll keep coming." Charles looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Then we'll keep fighting." As the SUV pulled away, Emily stared out the window, the weight of the battle pressing down on her. They had taken another step toward justice, but the network wasn't done yet. And Emily knew the next strike would be even more devastating. The SUV sped through the darkened streets, the silence inside tense and heavy. Emily clutched the hard drive in her lap, her fingers pressing into the padded envelope as if it were a lifeline. Charles sat beside her, his phone pressed to his ear as he coordinated with his team. "We need a secure location to analyze this data," he said, "and I want double security on Judge Carter. No one gets through without my approval." Emily turned to him, her voice firm despite her exhaustion. "We can't sit on this. The longer we wait, the more time they have to cover their tracks." "I know," Charles replied, his tone matching hers. "But we can't make a move without knowing exactly what's on that drive. It's our only leverage." The vehicle turned into a quiet, gated compound where a team of agents awaited their arrival. Emily and Charles stepped out, escorted inside by the armed guards. The safe house was outfitted with high-tech equipment, and a team of analysts was already setting up to examine the hard drive. Emily handed it over, her eyes locked on the lead analyst. "Be thorough," she said. "Every file, every detail. We need everything." The analyst nodded and got to work. Hours passed as Emily paced the room, her nerves frayed. Charles sat nearby, monitoring updates from his team. The safe house was quiet, but the weight of the situation hung in the air. Every so often, Charles's phone buzzed with reports from the field, details of increased surveillance, chatter about the network's movements, and updates on David Green's disappearance. Finally, the analyst called them over. "We've got something," he said, his face pale. "And it's big." Emily and Charles crowded around the monitor as the analyst began to explain. "The files on this drive are detailed financial records, communications, and blackmail material. The network isn't just a criminal syndicate. They're deeply embedded in corporations, governments, even law enforcement. This is the kind of evidence that could bring down powerful people." Emily's breath caught. How powerful? The analyst clicked on a folder labeled Key Figures. Inside were documents naming politicians, CEOs, judges, and high-ranking law enforcement officials. Emily's eyes scanned the list, her stomach twisting as she recognized some of the names. "Some of these people are the same ones who intervened in the trial," she said. "They're not just protecting Harris. They're protecting themselves." Charles leaned closer. "What's this?" he asked, pointing to a folder marked Operations. The analyst opened it, revealing a series of files detailing the network's ongoing activities. One file stood out, Operation Blackout. "What's Operation Blackout?" Emily asked. The analyst hesitated before opening the file. Inside were plans for a coordinated cyber attack targeting critical infrastructure, power grids, communication networks, and financial systems. The date for the attack was set for 2 days from now. Emily's heart raced. This isn't just about covering their tracks. They're planning to destabilize the system. Charles cursed under his breath. This is their endgame. If they pull this off, chaos will cover everything they've done. Emily straightened, her resolve hardening. Then we stopped them. The next 24 hours were a blur of activity. Charles and his team worked tirelessly to mobilize resources, coordinating with federal agencies to prepare for the network's planned attack. Emily stayed close, lending her insight and pushing for swift action. But the network wasn't idle. Reports began flooding in of increased activity, movements in and out of key locations, encrypted communications spiking, and suspicious financial transactions. It was clear they knew the walls were closing in. As the deadline for Operation Blackout loomed, Emily and Charles prepared for their final move. The data from the hard drive had provided leads on the network's command center, a secure facility in a remote industrial area. It was their only chance to shut down the operation before it began. The convoy approached the facility under the cover of darkness. Charles's team moved silently, their weapons at the ready. Emily stayed in the command vehicle, monitoring the situation through a live feed. Team 1, in position, came a voice over the radio. No movement detected. Team 2, moving to the perimeter, another voice reported. Emily watched the screens, her heart pounding. She knew this was their best shot, but the stakes couldn't be higher. If they failed, the fallout would be catastrophic. Breaching in 3, 2, 1. Charles's voice came through. The live feed showed the team entering the facility. The first room was empty, filled with computer terminals and scattered papers. But as they moved deeper, resistance emerged. Armed guards opened fire, and chaos erupted. Shots fired. Charles shouted, "We've got hostiles." Emily's grip tightened on the armrest as she watched the team fight their way through the facility. The gunfire was deafening, but Charles's team was well-trained and methodical. Slowly, they gained ground. "Target in sight," Charles reported. "We've found the main server room." The live feed showed a fortified room filled with racks of servers and monitors. Charles's team breached the room, taking down the guards inside. One of the analysts moved to the servers, beginning the process of shutting down the operation. "Shutting it down now," the analyst said. "But it's going to take time." Emily's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and froze. It was a message, "While you're distracted, we're making our next move. Check the courthouse." Her blood ran cold. She turned to the communications officer. "Get me a live feed of the courthouse. Now." The officer quickly pulled up the cameras. The screen showed a suspicious van parked outside, and men in dark clothing moving toward the building. "They're hitting the courthouse," Emily shouted. "It's a diversion." Charles's voice came through the radio. "What's happening?" "They're targeting the courthouse," Emily said. "They're after the remaining evidence." Charles cursed. "I'll send a team, but we can't leave the facility yet. If we don't finish here, they'll still have the means to launch their attack." Emily's mind raced. "I'll go to the courthouse," she said. "I know what they're after." "Absolutely not," Charles snapped. "It's too dangerous." "I don't have a choice," Emily replied. "You said it yourself, they're desperate. If they destroy that evidence, this whole case falls apart." Before Charles could respond, Emily was already moving. She grabbed her coat and headed for the nearest vehicle, her determination overriding her fear. The fight wasn't over, not yet, and Emily was about to face her greatest challenge. The SUV screeched to a halt outside the courthouse, its headlights illuminating the steps leading up to the grand doors. Emily Carter stepped out, her heart pounding. The night was eerily quiet, save for the faint hum of streetlights. Her eyes scanned the surroundings, searching for any sign of the intruders. "Stay close," said Agent Taylor, one of Charles's trusted men, as he exited the vehicle behind her. He gripped his firearm tightly, his gaze sharp. "They're here somewhere," Emily nodded, clutching the bag she had brought along. Inside it were her notes, backup copies of crucial evidence, and a burner phone preloaded with Charles's emergency contacts. She knew this wasn't just about preserving the case, it was about survival. The courthouse doors were ajar, swaying gently in the night breeze. Emily's pulse quickened as she stepped inside, Taylor following close behind. The grand hallway was dimly lit, the usual hum of activity replaced by an unsettling silence. Papers were strewn across the floor, and the faint smell of burnt wiring lingered in the air. "They've been here," Taylor muttered, his voice low. "Stay alert." The two moved cautiously through the building, checking each room as they passed. As they approached the evidence storage area, Taylor raised a hand, signaling Emily to stop. He leaned against the wall, listening intently. Footsteps. They were faint but deliberate, coming from the corridor ahead. Taylor motioned for Emily to stay back as he advanced, his gun raised. Emily pressed herself against the wall, her breath shallow. The footsteps grew louder, and then a figure emerged from the shadows, dressed in black and carrying a duffel bag. The intruder froze as Taylor shouted, "Drop the bag! Hands where I can see them." Instead of complying, the man lunged forward, pulling a weapon from his holster. Taylor fired a single shot, hitting the man in the shoulder and sending him sprawling to the ground. Emily flinched at the sound, but she forced herself to step forward. "Who sent you?" Taylor demanded, kicking the weapon away and pinning the man down. The intruder groaned, clutching his shoulder. "You don't know what you're dealing with," he spat. "You're already too late." Emily crouched beside him, her fear giving way to anger. "What are you talking about? What's the plan?" The man sneered, blood trickling from his lip. "You'll see." Before Emily could press further, Taylor's earpiece crackled. "Multiple hostiles on site," came a voice from Charles's team. "They're heading for the evidence room." Emily's stomach twisted. "They're after the files," she said, standing abruptly. "We have to stop them." Taylor nodded, securing the injured man with a zip tie before motioning for Emily to follow. They moved quickly through the corridors, the sound of distant footsteps echoing off the walls. As they neared the evidence room, Emily spotted two men rifling through boxes, their movements frantic. "Hands up!" Taylor shouted, aiming his weapon. The men turned, their eyes wide with panic. One of them reached for a gun, but Taylor fired, dropping him instantly. The second man froze, his hands trembling in the air. "Don't shoot," he stammered. I'm just doing what they told me." "Who's they?" Emily demanded, stepping forward. The man hesitated, his eyes darting between Emily and Taylor. "I don't know their names," he said quickly. I just work for the boss." "And who's the boss?" Emily pressed. The man swallowed hard. "Not Harris. He's small time. The real boss. He's untouchable." Taylor stepped closer, his gun still trained on the man. "Start talking, or you'll regret it." Before the man could respond, a sharp beeping sound filled the room. Emily's eyes darted to the floor, where a small device blinked red. "Bomb!" Taylor shouted. "Move!" The three of them bolted from the room as the device exploded, sending a shockwave through the building. Emily was thrown to the ground, her ears ringing as debris rained down around her. She scrambled to her feet, coughing through the dust. Taylor grabbed her arm. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine," she managed, though her head throbbed. "What about the evidence?" Taylor glanced back at the smoldering remains of the room. Gone. Emily's heart sank. The files they had fought so hard to protect were now ashes. The network had struck another blow, and this time, it felt crippling. Minutes later, Charles arrived with reinforcements. He pulled Emily aside, his face a mask of frustration. "They've burned the evidence, but we still have the hard drive," he said. "We're not done yet." "They're escalating," Emily said, her voice steady despite the chaos. "They've crossed every line, and they won't stop until they win. Or we stop them." Charles nodded. "Then we need to hit them where it hurts." Emily looked at him, her resolve unshaken. "What's our next move?" Charles hesitated for only a moment. "We use the hard drive. It's the last piece we have, but it's enough to blow this wide open. The network thrives on secrecy. Let's take that away from them." Emily's eyes narrowed. "How?" "We release everything," Charles said. "We go public. All the names, all the transactions, all the operations. Let the world see what they've done." Emily considered his words, the enormity of the decision settling over her. It was risky, dangerous even, but it was their best chance to bring the network to its knees. "Do it," she said finally. "Expose them." As Charles's team prepared for the data dump, Emily sat alone in a quiet corner of the safe house. Her body ached, and her mind was exhausted, but her determination remained. She knew the fight was far from over, but for the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope. The network had underestimated her, and now, they were about to face the consequences. But as she stared at her reflection in the window, her phone buzzed. It was another anonymous message, You think this is over? We're just getting started. Emily's grip tightened on the phone. She knew the battle wasn't won yet, but she was ready for whatever came next. The operation to expose the network began in the dead of night. Charles's team worked tirelessly in a secure room, their fingers flying across keyboards as they decrypted files, uploaded documents, and prepared for the final strike. Emily Carter sat nearby, her eyes fixed on the monitors displaying the incriminating evidence. Every detail of the network's web, its connections, its crimes, its enablers, was about to go public. This will hit every major news outlet, government database, and independent investigative platform simultaneously, Charles said, his tone grim. Once we push the button, there's no going back. Good, Emily replied, her voice steady. They've thrived in the shadows for too long. It's time to drag them into the light. As the countdown to the release ticked down, the network made their final move. Reports flooded in of heightened activity, a surge of communications, vehicles on the move, and suspected attacks being prepared. Emily knew they were desperate, but she also knew this was their last stand. They're trying to stop us, Charles said, watching the intel stream in. But it's too late. We've locked them out of every digital backdoor. Emily nodded. Then let's finish this. The team counted down in unison. 3, 2, 1. With the press of a button, the data was unleashed. In seconds, the information spread across the globe. News anchors interrupted broadcasts to report breaking revelations. Social media exploded with hashtags and trending topics tied to the scandal. Governments scrambled to issue statements as the public demanded answers. Names of high-ranking officials appeared on every screen. Details of secret bank accounts, bribes, and illicit deals filled headlines. The network's carefully constructed empire was unraveling, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. The fallout was immediate. Arrests were made across the country as law enforcement agencies moved swiftly, armed with the irrefutable evidence. Protests erupted in major cities, with citizens demanding accountability from those in power. The names of the network's operatives were on everyone's lips, and their influence was crumbling by the hour. Luke Harris, who had been transferred to a federal facility, watched the news from his cell. His usual smirk was gone, replaced by a look of pure fury. He knew there was no escaping now. Everything he had built was gone, and the people he had trusted to protect him were being taken down one by one. For Emily, the victory was bittersweet. She stood in a press conference flanked by Charles and other law enforcement officials, addressing a room packed with reporters. This has been a long and difficult battle, she began, her voice firm but emotional. The network thrived on greed, corruption, and fear. But today, we prove that no one is above the law. Justice will always prevail. The room erupted in applause, but Emily's thoughts were elsewhere. She knew the fight had come at a cost. The lives lost, the constant danger, the sleepless nights. But as she looked out at the faces of the victims' families in the crowd, she knew it had been worth it. Weeks later, Emily returned to her courtroom for the first time since the trial's suspension. The building had been repaired, and the charred remnants of the evidence room were gone, replaced with new furniture and walls. As she sat at her bench, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't felt in months. The fight was over. The network was dismantled, and its leaders were behind bars. The evidence they had tried so hard to destroy had ultimately been their undoing. And though the scars of the battle remained, Emily knew she had done what was right. Charles visited her that afternoon, his usual no-nonsense demeanor softened by a rare smile. "You did it," he said, handing her a coffee. "You took them down." "We did it," Emily corrected, returning the smile. "And I couldn't have done it without you." He nodded, leaning against the desk. "So, what's next?" Emily thought for a moment, then smiled. "Justice doesn't stop, Charles. And neither do we." That night, Emily returned home for the first time in what felt like forever. She sat on her couch, flipping through channels until she landed on a news report about the network. The anchors were still discussing the fallout, the arrests, and the systemic changes being implemented to prevent another shadow empire from taking root. Her phone buzzed with a message from Charles. "It's over, Emily. Sleep well." Emily smiled, setting the phone down. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to relax. As she closed her eyes, The weight of the past weeks lifted. The battle was over, and justice had won. But in the quiet of the night, Emily knew one truth would remain with her forever. Even in the darkest corners, the light of justice could always shine through.